I met Cormac. I was tending bar in a beer joint on Cumberland Avenue. All stories start with it was working at a beer joint. And Cormac came in, it was snowing that day, and he and the world's worst reprobate, John Shadden, a local colorful character and a longtime friend of Cormac's, came in looking for Jimmy Boroff, who owned the place. Of course, there were 30, 40 different owners while I worked there, you know. You cashed your check out of the cash register. And anyhow, these two characters come in, and Cormac is very much dapper, you know, and John's a wild man. John's about 6'4". So they're waiting for Boroff. They decide to have a beer. It's about 11 o'clock in the morning. You know, a beer breakfast is good. And so they start playing, you know, who knows who and who knows what, and trivia about authors. I'm sitting there with my feet up on a beer cooler, you know, trying to figure out how I'm going to make $1 for the day. And all of a sudden, they get a beer, they go in to get a toast. And the toast is pretty simple. It's from J.P. Dunleavy's book, The Ginger Man. So, those two morons. God's mercy, I chimed in on the Wild Ginger Man. And Cormac looked up at me, he goes, "My life is complete, I've met a literate bartender." Quote. Needless to say, it turned into an all-day debacle, and fortunately it had snowed, so nobody was out and about. But that was in probably 71, I guess. And we had stayed in contact and had become friends and for all that period of time. I used to have breakfast with him at Long's Drugstore for years when he was waiting to get the MacArthur grant, I think is what funded all of that, you know. He could tell you a story about paint drying and you'd be fascinated by it. I mean, he was the best storyteller, and I've known some I've ever seen. And, you know, it didn't hurt that we were both Irishmen, and we had spent a little time in the Emerald Isle. And then he had his half-wit brother, Dennis, who was a lawyer here in town. You may know Dennis. Dennis is out there setting up the Cormac McCarthy Library. You know, I'm sure we'll exit through the what is it they say? Exit through the gift shop. It'll be one of those kind of deals. Yeah, he was a wolf after the coin. But anyhow, we would discuss nonsense, everything else. But he was truly the greatest storyteller I've ever met in my life, and God knows I've met some. And he was a very, very bright, articulate man. And he did have a flaw or two. He drove a 1954 Rambler for about 300,000 miles because, you know, why get a new car? And he lived in a motel on Kingston Pike, right where the Kroger is now, in Bearden. But we would chat on the phone, and he was the most private person I've ever met. He had no interest. He was like J.D. Salinger. In fact, I think he was chipping a little of that from Salinger, because he didn't do interviews, he didn't do anything. Even when his movies came out and started making some serious bang, he was not interested in all that. But the last time I spoke to him had to be around St. Patrick's Day, because we always tried to get in touch with one another around St. Patrick's Day. And I could tell he was, you know, he was no spring chicken, as they say in East Tennessee.
Let me ask you first.
Okay.
What are some of the qualities that stand out to you if you're going to describe Cormac McCarthy?
Loyalty. He had the same friends, and I inherited every one of them when he left town. And I represented them. They became my friends, a bunch of lawyers, a bunch of old reprobates from Felony Flats, as he liked to call his old neighborhood. But very, very loyal. And didn't discriminate. I mean, he would, if you guys wanted to go, and he didn't drink for many, many years. He didn't drink alcohol at all. And a friend of ours had called me and said, "I need Cormac's telephone number." And I said, "I'll give it to you on one condition. Don't give it to anybody else." So he hooked up with him in Santa Fe. Then went out and had a few cordials together. And he knew people forever. I mean, it wasn't like he reinvented himself and had a whole new group of folks. If you were his friend, if he didn't like you, you knew about that pretty quickly. He didn't speak, or he would say something inappropriate for television. You know.
Did you ever read any of his books, and if so, did you find any that you liked particularly?
I read every one of them
Really?
because I used to buy my books in Buffalo with the covers ripped off, and they were 35 cents a piece. I do recall that. So I never had any money. I was in law school, and I think I've read everything he's ever written. My personal favorite was Child of God. Have you ever read Child of God?
I've heard horror stories about
It's a horror story. But it's fabulous because it's East Tennessee at its best or at its worst. And I shouldn't say just East Tennessee, I think maybe Appalachia, because, and his characters were all based upon people that he knew, or the majority of them were. And he wasn't opposed to picking your brain for a good storyline, But all of the people that I inherited from him, I hate to use that word, have all moved on. Of course, they're all close to 90 years old. Not that it's affected me age-wise at all.
You made the observation, Dennis, that you were concerned about his health. What made you say that?
Conversation with him, you could just tell because he was, he'd had a couple bumps in the road health-wise, who hasn't? But he was kind of, in fact, I think I mentioned to you one time, you ought to get a package together because you'd be here pretty soon. Yeah, he just had a certain passion about life that most folks don't ever get to, And he could spend 3 pages of a novel describing the sweat on the bridle of a horse. I mean, who else can do that? Most of us can't walk a straight line and chew gum. But loyalty was his biggest asset, I think.
A couple more questions. He kind of knew many of Knoxville's darker spots.
He knew every one of them. Every one of them. And I've been to most of those darker spots with him. Yeah. This is in the days when on Alcoa Highway you had the Senators Club and you had all of these. The first time I went out and spent the evening with him and Shadden, all I remember was he knew all the gamblers. Okay, he didn't gamble, but he knew the gamblers. They had built a pyramid. I don't think anybody's interested in this, but I'll tell you. A pyramid of beer glasses with a little hole at the top. And the bet was, could you throw a beer can through that little hole without breaking any of the glasses? And they're betting, of course I'm broke, but they're betting, not him. Shad and the rest of those boys were all betting $500 on Ricky Johnson, who is hopefully still alive with us today. Ricky and Doris Hawkins Johnson, who was a lawyer here in town. And Ricky was a professional gambler. Ricky's claim to fame was he never had a job. Cormac's only claim that he ever had a job was when he got out of the Air Force. He worked for a few months in an auto parts store or something such as that. And I never did quite figure out what the hell was going on with all that because he was not an auto parts kind of guy.
And I just wonder if there's any particular thought or memory that you want to share or any point that you want to make sure viewers know about him, who he was and what he meant to East Tennessee, Knoxville, Tennessee, the world.
I'd say to the world, he was a fabulous writer. He was what in the old days we'd call a raconteur, if you know what that term means. Because no matter what you were talking about, he'd have an opinion on it. The man did not suffer from lack of opinions, I can tell you that. But I think the biggest factor was just that if he liked you, he liked you. But we would go out and go to Happy Hollow, for example. The Cotton Club, Tommy's, and these places where it was the East Knoxville Gun and Knife Club meeting. And hell, everybody in there would know Cormac. Of course, he had gone to high school here. And then he said he briefly attended the University of Tennessee. We never really discussed that too much. But all of his buddies, like Shadden and those guys, were gamblers, con men. One of my favorites out of all that group, who is no longer with us, sold aluminum siding. And his scam was to sell aluminum siding and mobile home tie-downs. Now, these are the kind of guys that had good stories. You're not going to get a lot of stories from an accountant. You had to get out and kind of mix and mingle. But, he came back to Knoxville 3 or 4 years ago. A guy that he had grown up with had passed away, and Cormac was in England working on something, and he got on a plane and flew to Knoxville, Tennessee to be there for his friend. And that was what I think was his most enduring quality, other than his talent, was that just, and you couldn't get anybody to cut loose from this group of his, because it was just a hell of a lot of fun to hang with, you know. And once he got in the movie business, his financial fortunes changed, and he has a son, John Francis McCarthy, who was the same age as my daughter McKenna. And so we would kind of use that as two old geezers with little kids, you know, trying to make our way in the world. But I want to close with something. God's mercy on the Wild Ginger Man, because he was the Wild Ginger Man. That's it for me.
Thank you, Dennis.
Sorry.
No, I appreciate that. I appreciate that very much. And I appreciate you coming in. I
Well,
really do.
that fucker, he was just amazing. You could go through his last two works, the book about where Shadden is the primary character. When I met Cormac and Annie, they were both living out on Light Pink Road in beautiful Blount County, Tennessee. And if he'd had a bad night, he'd tell Annie, bring me my typewriter, I'm going to work in bed today. You know, that kind of stuff. Yeah.